Hey guys, Scott here. Today I want to go over the whole history of 3genning and go over why 3genning has gotten worse in Dead by Daylight over time. For those unaware, 3genning is when there are 3 gens left on the entire map. You have 1 gen left to finish, and they're all very close to each other. This is a situation I'm sure you've probably been in where it becomes much harder for the survivors to win because the killer doesn't really have to go anywhere anymore. Typically, if the generators are very spread out, the killer can't defend all of them and you'll end up winning. But if the gens are all clustered together very closely, it's very easy for the killer to win, and that's pretty much when the killer is at their strongest. Now, there's two types of 3genning. There is the 3genning where it's basically the survivor's fault. They just simply screwed up. They did all the gens on one side of the map, for example, or whatever reason. You can't really blame anybody but the survivors there. It happens in solo queue a lot because there's no communication. Perks like Deja Vu and stuff can fix that. Maps can fix it too. But that's pretty much entirely up to the survivors, and the killer might realize, oh shit, they screwed up. I have a 3gen now. This is great. There's also another form of 3genning that's much more malicious and annoying, which is where the killer loads into the map with the intention of 3genning. And they will typically bring map offerings like RPD or Haddonfield that have guaranteed 3gens, and they just simply will never leave those generators. It doesn't matter if there's 5 gens left or 1 gen left, they will never leave those generators. They will never chase you anywhere but in the radius of those generators. And at that point, there's physically nothing survivors can do to stop a killer from playing like this. And I think that's kind of a problem. It's not impossible to win. You can still beat them. I'm just saying survivors have no choice in this strategy that the killer decides to use. And this is something a lot of killers have decided to use increasingly more and more lately. So I want to go over the whole history of 3genning. It's pretty much been a thing since the game came out. It first rose to notable prominence when Doctor was a thing. I say that as if he doesn't exist now. Doctor can still do this, but there was that whole famous build of distressing, unnerving presence and things like that. That was the first version of this. You would combo it with old Overcharge as well, and you would have sort of the semblance of a 3gen build because the Doctor would sit in distressing, the unnerving presence would make the Overcharge skill stacks very small, and survivors would struggle to break that 3gen. That was basically the first version of it. That's like 5 years old at this point, so it's been in the game for a very, very long time, but it didn't really get notably bad until a few patches ago when they buffed Eruption. I know it's nerfed again now, but this is the patch where Eruption was buffed and Overcharge was buffed, and people thought, Eruption was buffed. You have to kick a generator for this to apply. Overcharge was buffed. You have to kick a gen for this to apply. Call of Brian's been sitting on the back burner. You have to kick a generator to apply it. Let's use all these perks. And then the infamous slowdown build was created, and it wasn't really some niche build. It was really obvious when you saw all the buffs and people started realizing, oh shit, this is really, really strong. Then people started realizing, okay, this still doesn't quite work if I don't have all my gens within kicking distance. How can I address this? And then people started, turning the gears and going, okay, actually, how about I just don't ever leave these 3 gens from the start? Yeah, I'm going to get down to 1 gen and I might have 0 hooks at 1 gen left, but then I'll be able to use all these perks easily for the rest of the entire match. And that's going to be a lot easier for me to win. And then we started seeing that happening more and more. And then behavior started throwing salt on the wound. They started releasing even more killers that are 3 gen centric. They released the Knight, who is extremely good at holding a 3 gen. Then they've released the Skull Merchant, who's very good at holding a 3 gen. So they're not helping either. And now we're in this scenario where you can literally hold the game hostage until the server shuts down. And it's not even really that difficult to do. The most problematic killers that people are complaining about for doing these strats right now are the Knight and the Skull Merchant, and I want to go over how we can fix these types of issues. But I really want to go into it deeper. Why are the Knight and the Skull Merchant so good at doing 3 gens? And the thing is, they're not really that good at doing 3 gens. If you really boil it down to the truth, the reason that the Knight and the Skull Merchant are so good at 3 gens is because they're just shit at everything else. There's nothing else they can really do. And if you take a step further back from that, you realize that 3genning is not even really a killer-specific thing. It's a perk-related thing. It's nothing to do with the killer itself. Now, there are a couple of things that the Knight and the Skull Merchant can do to, delay you a bit. A guard might chase you off a gen. That's annoying. But if you do all of these strategies on a build that doesn't have the slowdown 3 gen build, it doesn't matter. You can't do it. I even tested this. I did a whole experiment like a month ago where I played Wesker using his power, but I didn't use slowdown perks and things like that. And then I played Wesker not using his power, just M1ing people, but I used a 3 gen slowdown build, and I won vastly more times in the no power slowdown build. because it's not really a killer specific thing. It's perks and strategy that is what makes a 3-gen build. So when people always say, like, the Skull Merchant and the Knight are so good at it, they're not really. They're just bad at everything else. For example, you know who the best 3-gen killer in the entire game is? It's Nurse. You know who the second best 3-gen killer is? It's Blight. The third best is Spirit. And wow, wouldn't you know it, those are the top 3 killers in the game for everything else. The reason people don't complain about those types of scenarios is A, they either die before there's even 1 gen left to do, so the scenario simply doesn't happen to begin with, or B, if they are in a 3-gen scenario, they just die way faster. Because the Skull Merchant and the Knight, for example, have no real lethality to end chases when they have a 3-gen. But a Nurse and a Blight, they're just going to kill you in 20 seconds. And now there's a 3v1 with a 3-gen. And you don't really remember those games because you die so fast, and it's whatever. You had an 8-minute game against a Nurse. Well, that's new and exciting. What you do remember is the hour-long match against the Knight, or the hour-long match against the Skull Merchant. And it's not because they're so good at holding it, it's because they're so bad they can't kill you before the match ends due to the server timeout. And that's the real problem. It's not that it's a strong strat, it's that killers are so shit that they have to rely on doing this. So how do you fix that? It is extremely complicated because you can't just nerf 3-genning without doing anything else, or killers like the Knight and Skull Merchant become unusably bad. But you can't buff the Knight and Skull Merchant without touching 3-gens, because then that will just exacerbate that issue even more. And so it's such a complicated thing, but it is possible to fix. You can fix this. It's just something I think that is impossible for behavior, because the way you do it is a multi-pronged series of changes all in a row, and they have to happen basically at the same exact time. And that is where it's problematic. So let's talk about what you actually have to do. So the first thing you have to do is nerf the bad killers. You have to nerf the bottom tier killers that rely on the strat because there's simply nothing else that they're good at. If you give them other playstyles, it will let them do things that are not 3-gens, and that will be nice. But you also have to be mindful of the fact that if you buff them without touching the 3-gens, some of them will still do it anyway. That's why it's so dangerous to balance things in these games, because you have to assume even if you incentivize people to play in a more fun way, you're just gonna go, well, I want to win, and do the unfun shit anyway. So it's really hard to try to think about that. So that's why I said you have to do these changes at the exact same time. So the first thing is go to maps that have guaranteed 3-gens. Maps like Haddonfield, RPD, for example, Dead Dog Saloon. There are maps that, no matter what, even without RNG, will always spawn 3-gens, which means killers can guarantee that you're put into the scenario no matter what. Those maps need to have their generator placements manually adjusted. That's step 1. Step 2 is more complicated, because on big maps like Red Forest, 3-gens are not that big of a deal. Even if the killer wants to plan one out, typically the gens are so far spread out that they just can't really do it anyway, so it's not a big deal on those types of maps. Where it is a big deal is maps like Cold Tower, Wrecker's Yard, Rancid Abattoir, the smaller ones, because it's really, how do you actually stop 3-gens from generating? There's just not enough space for that to even happen. And the only thing I can think of is when you have small maps, you force generators to spawn on the outskirts. Because the way you get 3-gens is when there's like a middle gen and then 2 outskirt gens forming a triangle that's unstoppable. If you at least have gens on all of the outskirts, it increases the distance between a 3-gen a bit. On small maps, there's pretty much no possible way to prevent it, but if you sort of push everything outward on only small maps, you do get a bit more distance between the gens that makes it a bit more viable to try to play around, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But even then, I'm not pretending this is an easy solution. It's really, really hard to do this. And so if you do those changes at the same time that you buff the other killers, you basically remove 3-gens and then you buff the killers that rely on 3-gens, then we have a scenario where it's not as strong anymore. And people won't really want to do it. And the reason people keep doing it is because, yeah, it's just really good. There are so many upsides to holding 3-gens. It makes it so the effect of your slowdown perks is much, much stronger because you can apply them way more rapidly and in succession over and over again. It forces all survivors into a small spot, which aids in snowballing. Like, there are a number of reasons that doing 3-gen strats are super effective. And you don't see it as much on the strongest killers because they don't have to. I guess that's the whole point what it boils down to. We need killers to be, the weaker killers to be strong enough to a point they don't have to rely on it, and then once they don't have to rely on it, then we can remove it from the game. and I don't see that ever happening. So enjoy your hour-long skull merchant games.